This was a while back, but still bothers me to this day. It was 2016, and me, 22, and my husband, 28, were moving into a rental home. I was 6 months pregnant, and we were thrilled to move into a nice community since before we had lived in a sketchy part of town. We didn't know much about this rental, except it was in a good school district, low crime area, and within our budget. Time passes without any problems, and soon our son was born. His birth was textbook, and he slept well in the hospital. This all changed when we brought him home. The first night was awful. Every time we set him in his crib, he screamed. I'm not talking a normal "I'm hungry" or "need a new diaper" cry. A legitimate scream like he was in pain. My husband and I had to take shifts at night, so one could be with him and the other could sleep. My shift was always second, and started around 2 to 3 in the morning. I tried my best to sleep, but shortly after my son's birth, I began having horrible nightmares. I would dream nightly about my son being hurt or needing me, and I couldn't get to him. At my 6-week checkup, I told my OBGYN, and she believed I was having postpartum anxiety and prescribed me medicine, recommending I see a counselor. Weeks passed by since starting the medicine and counseling, and I was still having nightmares, and my son was still screaming all night long. His pediatrician told us it was colic and that we just needed to wait it out. Everything changed when he turned 3 months old. His screaming continued, but started to be all day instead of just at night. My nightmares became much more specific. One night, I dreamed that I walked into my son's room and he was on fire and screaming. Though I was in his room, my feet were stuck inside his doorway. I couldn't move or speak. I could only watch my son screaming in pain. I woke up screaming and hyperventilating. My husband ran into our room and tried to console me. The next few days I could not sleep. I spent most of my days at work and my evenings sitting on my front porch talking to my next-door neighbor. She was the sweetest old lady who had lived in this neighborhood since it was originally built in the 70s. I guess she could tell something was wrong and asked me if I was okay. Reluctantly, I told her how my baby had been acting and how I was having horrible nightmares. She was sympathetic and asked me to elaborate. I didn't feel comfortable telling her the details, so I just told her I had dreams about fire in the house. Her face quickly changed from caring and concerned to horrified. Seconds of quiet felt like hours before she spoke again. "Do you know what happened at this house?" she said. I told her no. She sighed and looked down before grabbing my hands and then looking at me. She goes on to tell me that a few years ago there was a fire at the house. It was due to some faulty wiring done poorly by the landlord. There was a young family with a 3-month-old baby living there, and unfortunately, the baby passed away in the fire. She said the couple moved away, and the house was renovated and put up for rent after that. I was in shock. I ran inside to my husband holding our baby and told him we needed to leave. He must have seen the fear in my eyes since he did not ask me to explain myself until we had got in the car. I explained what happened in the house and how I felt like my dreams were warnings that we needed to leave before something happened to our baby. Luckily, my brother-in-law lived in the next town over, so we went there. The first night we stayed in his house, our son slept through the night. Not a single peep. I checked on him every hour since it was so unusual for him to sleep this well. From then on, apart from normal baby stuff, my son never screamed again like he did in that house. My husband packed our stuff, and we stayed with my brother-in-law until we were able to get out of our lease and rent a new place. I never went back. I will never go back. I just pray for whoever moved in there next. Back in 1989, I was with my boyfriend, Eddie, his best friend, my older sister, Angie, and about 6 other people. We had spent the entire day mudding in the Royal Palm Mud Flats in Royal Palm Beach, Florida, aka part of Palm Beach County. I grew up in West Palm Beach. I had never seen anything like this before or since. After mudding all day, we decided to call it a night and leave. Almost everyone was gone by then, so we all piled into Eddie's truck and left. Eddie saw a small mud hole and drove through it as one last hurrah for the night, and we got stuck. That small hole was deceptive. When I say we got stuck, I mean we were stuck for hours. I was pregnant with my first, so I was steering as the other 9 were pushing. It did not budge. We had no choice but to wait until morning for someone to come pull us out, as we were now on our own. At about 5 a.m., we decided we should just relax and try to get some sleep until someone came through. Eddie, I, and his bestie were in front. My sister and the other 6, we are all still friends to this day, piled into the back and started to settle down. We were still making noise when I heard a sound. It was a rumbling growl. I knew immediately that it was some type of animal. I told everyone to hush and listen. We all heard it, and it was getting louder and more aggressive sounding. Eddie has a KC light behind his seat. He popped out, grabbed it, plugged it in, and lit the night up. That's when our world changed. 10 of us had our reality rocked in a way we never expected. This thing ducked down and moved. Everyone was starting to freak out because it was clearly there, but what was it? Then it got pissed. This thing stood straight up, let out a roar that I can still hear 31 years later, leapt the large bush it was standing behind, and charged us. You could feel the earth literally shake with every step it took. It was easily 8 to 9 feet tall. It was broad. It looked like an extremely large man with hair, not fur. It had hair and lots of it. The KC light lit it up, and you could see the clumping of the hair. The smell was rotten and sour. Being pregnant, I was extremely sensitive to smells, and it was bad. We had spent hours, we're talking 5+, trying to push this truck out. They say adrenaline gives you super strength, and they're right. Eddie turned on his truck and started pushing on the door frame. His bestie leapt out his side and did the same. My sister and the other 6 let out screams as they piled out, and then all you heard was this thing running and roaring. Everyone else was dead silent as they put everything they had into pushing this truck. With a sucking pop that I can also still hear, we were out, and they were throwing themselves into the back as Eddie and his bestie jumped in and he floored it. These are woods with tight turns, and we were hauling ass around them. It felt like the devil himself was chasing us. After we got out and onto the main road, we headed for a gas station to calm down and call our families. When we got there, we all got out, sat with our backs to the wall, and that was it. We never said a word to each other, just silence. I think we were too raw, scared, and in complete shock over what happened. This was lore. This wasn't real. They don't exist. Yet there it was. After we all called our parents, we went home, one by one being dropped off, not a word spoken. My sister and I did not discuss this until about 5 years ago. We finally opened up about that night, and I've slowly talked to the others. 25 years after the fact, and every single one of us that have spoken about it have the same exact story and memory forever burned into our minds. It wasn't cool. It was scary. I think the reason we couldn't talk about it for so long was because our brains were in denial at first, and then we didn't know how to open up about it. Now I can look back and say, holy crap, we saw Bigfoot. In 2003, I was a 20-year-old, recently single mother of a 1-year-old son. When the father of my then child, now children, moved out, I had no desire to live alone in my apartment, so my two best friends, Heather and Jamie, moved in. Jamie also had a son who was a little over a year old at the time. The 5 of us made a little home, and things were good. At some point, and I've tried so hard to remember how it started, but can't, Jamie, Heather, and I became kind of addicted to using a Ouija board. I had bought this board at Kmart for like $8 one year, and I think it was for that reason that I didn't take it very seriously. Boy, was I wrong. When we first started using it, I remained pretty skeptical, even as it began to tell us some pretty accurate and intimate things. Looking back, I always thought that Jamie was the one moving the planchette. I knew it wasn't Heather because at times, she was legitimately afraid. One day, I fought with the father of my sons. Super upset and crying, I hopped in my car by myself and just went for a cry drive. At the peak of being upset and alone in the car, I said aloud, "Is this my destiny, or am I supposed to fight to save this?" I went home to the loving arms of my friends, and as we did most nights, we got out the board. The very first thing the board said that night was, "Destiny changes with every breath." Neither of them could have possibly known what I had said in my car. That was the point when my skepticism started to fade away. We continued to use the board pretty much every night, and it continued to tell us things that would come true. At this point, the entity had claimed to be our collective spirit guide, Ben. One night, we had a male friend at the apartment. He was asleep on the couch behind us as we sat in our circle on the floor around the board. Heather remembered something from that night that I did not until she mentioned it recently. She had felt a cold presence wrap around her arm and then shoot up her nose. She started to freak out, but as I already told you, she was the scaredy cat of the group. I was more annoyed than worried or scared. We convinced her to sit back down, and that's when the board said something about not being happy that our male visitor was there. Almost immediately, he sat straight up on the couch and said, "What are you bitches doing to me?" He lifted his shirt, and he had several tiny handprints all over his chest and stomach. That was likely the point when I realized that we might be dealing with something darker than what it was selling itself as. What I didn't know then is that it would get much worse. We went to the local library and got some books about the occult. We brought them home, but never looked at them. Until, one night, the 3 of us and the 2 babies had been out somewhere. We came home and put the boys in the playpen. I started running the vacuum. As I was doing this, I heard Heather and Jamie screaming hysterically. I stopped to find out what was happening, and that's when they told me that they had heard a very loud thump, and then a child screaming bloody murder. They thought one of the boys had fallen from the playpen and gotten hurt, but both boys were still peacefully playing where we had left them. As they are telling me this, I was suddenly overcome by the smell of rotten meat. I'm a bit of a neat freak, and therefore there shouldn't have been anything causing this smell. I started searching high and low for the source, but it seemed to keep moving every time I got close to it. Meanwhile, Heather had grabbed one of the roughly 5 books we had picked up from the library, opened it to a random page, and started reading. She yelled out that I have to come read this. Annoyed, I replied, "I can't stop until I find where this smell is coming from." She said again to come read this now. I looked at her, and she was ghost white with tears streaming down her face. I walked over and took the book from her. The first paragraph of the page to which she had randomly opened the book to said, "The scream of a non-present child, accompanied by the smell of rotten flesh, signifies the presence of pure evil." I wish I could tell you what we did in the following minutes, but I don't remember. What I do remember is the next day, we took all of the books back to the library and got a Bible. We brought it home, left it open on a chair in the living room, and left for the rest of the day. I'm not even a religious person, but it's funny what you'll do when you're scared. We never used the board in that apartment again. If that story is the cake, this is the icing. Fast forward to June of 2004. I had given birth to my second son in February. Jamie and I were living in a different apartment, and Heather was living with a boyfriend. Heather came to visit, and for whatever reason, we broke out the board. After what had happened, I truly cannot explain why we chose to do it. I only remember one question from that day. Heather said to the board, "Jamie has a son. Itsamaysing has 2 sons. When will I ever have children?" And the board replied, "7 for you." So that became a running joke for the next several months. Like, ha ha, Heather's going to have 7 kids. Fast forward again, this time to January of 2005. I live with my children in yet another apartment. Jamie has moved in with her now husband, and Heather is living with a different boyfriend. I was laying in bed one night, and 7 for you just popped into my head. Suddenly it hit me. The board had said that in June, and it was now January. July, August, September, October, November, December, January. 7 months. Heather is pregnant now. I called her the next day to tell her that she was pregnant. She was very adamant that it was not possible. To shorten the back and forth that we did for the next 2 weeks, yes, she absolutely was pregnant. She gave birth to her first son in October of 2005. Since then, we've done the math. She was only about 2 weeks pregnant when I first told her. Although we are still all friends, I don't know a lot about what they've experienced paranormal-wise in the years since. I know that Heather had some pretty scary experiences in a house she lived in up until last year, where a previous tenant had committed suicide. I lived in the parsonage of a church for 10 years, and we had some pretty strange experiences there, including a time that my younger sister and I watched a full grocery bag that was hanging on a doorknob lift off the door until it was completely horizontal and then drop back down. Even my skeptical mother saw shadow figures in that house. Now we are in a new house, and my son, remember the son who was 1 in the apartment? He's almost 19 now. He and my brother are having some unusual experiences in the basement, which is where their bedrooms are. If you've made it through, thank you for reading. I'll keep you posted about anything that might occur in our new home. And oh yeah, I have pretty regular dreams where I'm screaming at demons to leave me and my family alone. But that's probably nothing, right? My husband and I live in an apartment complex in kind of a crappy neighborhood. Low-income homes, what have you. There are always lots of break-ins, and it's right next to kind of the downtown area of my city. It was mid-April of last year, and I was about 7 months pregnant, and my husband and I would often go out on our balcony late at night. Really just the outdoor catwalks of the apartments, which connected the outdoor stairwells and hallways. So it was either very late or very early, depending on your point of view, and it was quite dark, and my husband and I were standing outside looking at the moon over the tops of the apartments. He was smoking. I was unable to sleep due to back pain, the joys of pregnancy. We were chatting about whatever. Suddenly, in the dark before us from the first floor, we heard someone talking. It startled us both, and my husband cocked his head and made a shushing gesture as we both froze. A man's voice, low, was whispering something from the first floor directly below us. I had chills. I couldn't quite hear what he was saying, but it was only his voice, and he sounded like he was having a conversation with himself. As we stood there, both straining to hear him, his voice seemed to be moving away from us. Then we heard the distinct sound of someone shuffling up the stairs. He was climbing the steps to the second floor, slowly and deliberately, still muttering. My husband instinctively moved toward me and put out his cigarette as the man rounded the corner onto the outside landing we stood on. He was maybe 35 or 40, but he looked aged in a way that I can't really describe. His hair was prematurely gray. He looked really tired at first glance because of his body language, but his eyes were frantic. My husband later told me that he seemed to be high on meth. My husband wasn't a very good kid 15 years ago and had experience with certain drugs. The man was also, unexpectedly, walking a dog, a very pretty blue heeler. He walked right toward us, and my husband stepped in front of me protectively. The dog stopped suddenly, and so did the man. As if he had somehow just noticed us, he visibly jumped, then laughed. "Hello. Oh gosh, I didn't even see you there. Pardon me, just walking my little girl." He had the very definition of crazy eyes. They jumped all over the place, and when they landed on me, they jumped immediately to my big belly in an almost angry way. Oh, pregnant?" "What?" I said, sounding like a jerk even to myself. "You're pregnant, yeah? My wife, well, ex-wife, she used to be a doula, used to do those things, used to help out ladies and deliver them, yeah. Babies are great. I have 2 babies. Well, my wife has them. Well, my ex-wife, I guess, yeah." It's hard to really convey how he was talking. He sounded really excited, but also weirdly desperate. You could tell maybe he wanted someone to talk to. Now, I should mention that I'm a filthy bleeding heart, and my husband is a take-no-shit, look-out-for-number-one kind of guy. He cuts the guy off mid-ramble and says,
"We were just going inside, man. You have a good night."
Sure. I'm sorry. I'm Mike, by the way. I'm Mike. Mike." He sticks his hand out, and I shake it. His hands are soaking wet. I almost immediately yank my hand back, and he doesn't even notice. He's taking the dog leash and twisting it weirdly. Every muscle inside of my body is screaming for me to get away from this man. Instead, I tell him my name. My husband grabs my arm and yanks me toward the apartment, past Mike and the pretty dog. I waddle to the door, and as I open it, look back. Mike is watching me very intently. Once we get inside, we lock the door and talk about him. My husband is insisting he was on meth. He also mentions that it's weird that he's walking his dog upstairs at 3 a.m., when we knew he didn't live in our building. I wrote the guy off as a creepy drug addict, brought our shotgun into the bedroom, and fell asleep. 3 nights later, we are outside again. The building across the street from us is another apartment, and moments after we walk outside, Mike comes out, staring right at us, walking his dog. He is smiling weird and headed for the stairs. We wave and go inside and lock the door again. 2 days after that, I'm getting out of my car at around 4 p.m., and he appears, pretty much, at my trunk. 1 second I was grabbing my stuff, and the next he was standing there. There was no dog this time. He engages me in this weird conversation about how he knows my little girl is going to be beautiful, just like me, and how lucky I am. How I have to never ever get divorced because it ruins people's lives. I can tell he is extremely depressed. He says his daughters and wife left him only a few months ago. My husband yells for me from the balcony, and I make a lame excuse and leave Mike to his weird, jittery self. Husband interrogated me on what I said and warned me to just stay away from him. That night, there is a knock at my door. I check my phone, and it's seriously like 3:30 a.m. I have a lot of stupid neighbors that like to get wasted, so I decided to wait and see if they knock again. They do, this time more urgently. Feeling hot, fat, pregnant, and tired, I poke my husband with my foot and tell him someone is at the door. He continues snoring loudly. I resign myself to get out of bed. I threw on a robe and trotted out. Just before I unlocked it, I froze. Something told me to check the peephole. An unexplained feeling of dread washed over me. Slowly, I peeked through. At first, I didn't even know what I was looking at. I squinted and tried to focus my vision. Something didn't look right. It didn't look like the hallway. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The realization that I was staring directly into Mike's eye hit me, and I swear it felt like liquid ice in my veins. My stomach was in my feet. My breath caught. My hands immediately started pouring sweat. I jumped back from the door and started stumbling backwards. I backed into a wall and hit my head, trying to catch my breath. Mike knocked again and called my name softly, like he didn't want to wake anyone, like he knew I was there. He probably did. Looking into the opposite side of a peephole will show no clear images, but it will show shadows. I turned around and ran into my bedroom, shut the door, and shook my husband awake. He bolted upright and grabbed his shotgun. He told me to stay in bed. Gladly, dude. I heard him tell Mike to leave or he was going to call the police, and then silence. Within a minute, my husband came back into the room and said he was gone, that if I heard anything else to wake him up. I agreed and didn't sleep any more that night. Several weeks passed before we heard from him. In fact, we'd all but forgotten about him until our car got broken into. The cops showed up to collect evidence, and we told them about Mike, about his creepy behavior and how we suspected him of doing it. They seemed confused until we mentioned his dog, and then the officer paled. He asked for a full description of what Mike had done. He wanted a statement. Mike got picked up 2 nights after the peephole incident for aggravated sexual assault on a pregnant woman in her own home, 2 buildings down from us. He had extremely bad PTSD from his time in the Corps, and was also a meth abuser, just as the hubs had predicted. So glad I checked that stupid peephole. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. Links to all my shit are down in the description. So that's about it. I love you guys. Be good to animals, even people. Sip.
Ja, snämar, Bergsbus, Rish.